Familiar and exotic: the long history of Arab restaurants in the United States.
So thank you again for coming. So I'm at the Arab American National Museum. I'm also a lecturer at Arab and Muslim American Studies here at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where I received my PhD in 2010. My colleague Ryah Aqel couldn't make it today. She's stuck in Dearborn, but I will kind of do both of our parts. So how many of you have been to the Arab American Museum in Dearborn? Oh, wonderful. This is what I like to see. We like to see repeat visitors. You're coming to the museum, but here in Ann Arbor. So I'm happy to be. What's that? Yeah. And the restaurants, yes. So Dearborn, we're going to talk a lot about Dearborn. So my approach to food in the Arab American community is from a socio-cultural, historical perspective. So I don't deal a lot with like intricacies of recipes and where the food comes from. I focus mainly on the histories of why there are certain foods in certain restaurants and how they came to be popular and those kinds of things. So we can have, if you have some Q&A about specific ingredients and their histories, I might not be able to answer that, but I will try. So before we get started, or as we get started, much like many immigrant communities, when they come here to the United States, food establishments, grocery stores, dry goods import places, restaurants, cafes are some of the first businesses that they open. And they open them mainly to serve their own community, especially back in the 1800s when Arab Americans started coming. You couldn't find a lot of the goods, imported goods, raw materials for food, and you definitely couldn't walk into any restaurant and expect to serve or be served Arab food. So they opened restaurants mainly for their own community. And they did it very, very early. The first ones we know of were in the early 1890s, New York City, places like Boston. There were some in Detroit, but not as early as the 1890s. And they were mainly really small. They were called coffee houses or cafes. They would have served very minimal food, probably just some sweets and some bread, maybe some hummus, something small. And it was almost completely men that would go to these. It was a transition, a carryover from cafe culture in the Middle East, where mostly men would go to small cafes to smoke nargileh or hookah, play backgammon or cards, and talk about politics and those things. And so the cafe culture in the United States for Arab Americans was the same. So over here we have one of the earliest menus that I've seen. It's from the New York Public Library's menu collection. If you haven't spent some time with that online, they have thousands of menus digitized. They're amazing. This is one of the earliest. And if you look at it, it's got kind of the same things you might find in an Arab restaurant today. You've got lamb, you've got grape leaves, you've got eggplant, soup, liver, which isn't as popular in restaurants, but people still widely eat it, both at home and in restaurants. And my favorite here is the translation of intestines is translated as craps, which I assume they probably asked somebody who speaks English, what do you call the stuff, in your guts, your stomach? And someone's like, oh, crap. Oh, yeah, okay. Got some craps we're serving. So I probably wouldn't have ordered that if I was here in 1917. But yeah, so and you can see the name of the restaurant is the Syrian Restaurant for Ladies and Gents. And this is T. Shimshim's Restaurant and Turkish Coffee. So the names are very sort of descriptive of what they serve. And that changes a few years after this, which is what I will talk about mainly. This is an iconic picture from the Library of Congress of the early 1900s in some of these little Syrian restaurants. You can see how dingy they are. You can see the floors have not been swept in a while. People really just tea and coffee and nargileh. They're really not eating a lot of food, and it's all men. There's other pictures of this restaurant, and it's all men. And the other pictures, the person running the cash register, the person running the oven in the back is also a man. So it doesn't mean that women weren't involved. They just weren't as prevalent in the public spaces in the restaurants. And it was like that across immigrant cultures. It wasn't something that was just Arab or Arab American phenomenon. So then there's a transition in the 1920s, actually a little bit before that, 19-teens, 1920s. The Arab American community, especially in New York City, gets a little bit more established. At this point, they've been there for 20, 30 years. And the local non-Arab community in New York starts to get a little bit more adventurous. They start going to explore the other parts of Manhattan where all the different ethnic communities live. You have travel writers who go across New York City sampling all the different ethnic fare and writing about it in very exotic ways, really trying to showcase all the different cultures that are in New York City at the time. And the Arabs were reading this. They were reading these reviews in the newspaper. They were reading these write-ups. And they realized that if they wanted to branch out and if they wanted to sell food to a non-Arab public, they needed to play into that exoticism that they were seeing written about themselves in places like the New York Times. This is one example of the discovery of Little Syria. So you've got O. Henry. So you've got this writer. It's called Adventures in Interviewing. This guy goes around New York City and interviews famous folks. And they foregrounded a dirty, dingy restaurant on Washington Street, which was the heart of what was called the Little Syria community in New York City at that time. And they talk about the place is smelly and all these things, but that's why they went there. They went there for the atmosphere. O. Henry really liked eating in these quaint places. And this isn't the only mention of this. There's actually a few dozen mentions of writers going to these restaurants and talking about, oh, they're dirty and they're dingy, but they're as authentic as you can get, right? That's what you're looking for. And so the Arabs started playing up to that, and they played up to it in very specific ways. And one way was through the connection to the Bible. So what I didn't foreground with is the history of Arab Americans in the United States is that by this time in around 1900 in New York City, you had tens of thousands of Arabic-speaking immigrants who were living there. The vast majority of them were Christian, and the vast majority came from places like modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, and some from Iraq. So very Levant-focused from the Middle East. And they felt that part of their acceptance into American society, because at this time, believe it or not, there was a huge anti-immigrant movement in the United States. And so the Arabs were aware of this. They were aware that they were seen as an unwelcome invasion into white European society in the United States. And so they tried to quell everybody's fears by saying, oh, but we're Christian. We're not like as the language here, the Mohammedans that you read about. At that time, the Turks were really, World War I was approaching, and the Turks were an enemy, and so the Turks were Muslim, and that's how people talked about them. And so they were trying to separate themselves out from that. Yes? They were Maronite Catholic. They were Greek Orthodox. Some were actually Protestant. They had converted a few decades earlier as the American and British Protestant missionaries went all over Syria and Lebanon. But the majority of them were Christian. The Muslim Arabs at this time actually landed at Ellis Island, but they quickly left New York and went to places like North Dakota and Iowa and Michigan City, Indiana. They went where the factories were, or they went to the farmlands. They didn't stay in the big cities, which is what you would think. We think of recent Muslim immigrants all congregated in large cities. That's not what happened with the Arabs at that time. So they were playing up this idea that, hey, we're from the lands of the Bible, which they technically are, the Syrians and the Palestinians and the Iraqis. And so they played that up, and the papers ate it up as well. And so even into the 1930s, you have this guidebook where you've got these restaurants, which I'll talk about a few of them in depth. The Chic restaurant specializing in biblical foods, which I'm not really sure what that is. Loaves and fishes are about all I can think of. But they knew that that's how they could get people to come to the restaurant, was a taste of the exotic, a taste of the Bible. And then even this candy shop using utensils similar to those used in biblical times. I don't know how much candy making was in the Bible. I haven't read the New Testament in a while, but maybe I missed that part. Another way that became really popular for Arab Americans to sell their food to the public was through this idea of ancient Egypt. Even though none of these folks here were Egyptian, these were all Syrian and Lebanese owned places, but they knew that once King Tut's tomb was discovered in the 20s and the Art Deco movement started incorporating so much of Egyptian style architecture and art, that they knew that that's what the public was connecting Arab with ancient Egypt. So they started doing the same things for their restaurants. You've got places like the Pyramid Lounge. It's actually in my hometown in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and it's called the Pyramids, and they shaped the building to look like pyramids. And this is owned by a Lebanese Christian immigrant. And there's dozens and dozens of examples across the country of this, dating back as early as the 20s. in New York City, which is where it all really started. And here's a really good example of that. So Arabs were very adept at marketing their food, and marketing their food in ways that the general public would be enticed to come and to eat it. And so the story of this restaurant follows the release of the Hollywood blockbuster The Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino. It's one of the first Hollywood blockbusters, and it really launched his career. And it was about this Arab sheik, which ended up actually being a white European, Rudolph Valentino, dressed up as a sheik. But anyway, became really popular. They did a sequel called The Son of the Sheik. And so you've got restaurants like the Kardahi brothers. These are Lebanese immigrant brothers, Simon and Joseph Kardahi, who opened a restaurant in like the 1890s on Washington Street in New York City. And I don't know the exact date, but sometime a few years after the release of The Sheik, they changed the name of the restaurant to The Sheik. So same address here, 87 Washington Street in the lower east side of Manhattan, lower west side, sorry. And so they changed the name to The Sheik, and then thus started a revolution of Arab Americans, mostly Lebanese and Syrian, naming their restaurants The Sheik or the Son of Sheik or some version of it. This is the Son of Sheik, which was in Washington or in New York City for many, many decades. I think it lasted up through the 80s or 90s even. So you're talking like 80 years for a restaurant in New York City. It moved all over, went from the lower left, went from the Battery, and then ended up on 2nd Avenue and then 5th Avenue, and then it went to Brooklyn, where the community ended up and still is there. So lots of chic restaurants. You've got this place in Jacksonville, home of the Camel Rider, which was a burger. It had nothing to do with camels whatsoever. But wouldn't you want to go try that, right? I think this place is even still in business, but this opened in the 70s in Jacksonville, Lebanese owned. And then here in Detroit. So Detroit had its own chic restaurant. In fact, the Chic restaurant, which opened in the 30s and then went through a couple of different families and closed, I think, in the 80s or 90s, the Chic is said to have been the first Arab restaurant that catered to a non-Arab public. So most people who ate Lebanese food in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the Detroit area probably went to the Chic at some point. And you can see really wonderful graphics. I love the graphics on this. I think this was on Lafayette, was their last location. But really shows you again how across the country, Arab American restaurateurs who were like, we got to distinguish ourselves on the market. You know, how do we make people know that our food is something unique and something special? And they did it through what you could say is like very self-orientalizing ways. They were taking stereotypes about themselves and then using those stereotypes to sell the food. So you can be critical of that, or you can see them as really adept business people. I haven't made my decision yet. I've been working through this for a long time. Not exactly sure where I'm going to come down on that. And then the folk tales of the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights, is probably the most common way that even today Arab American restaurants sell their food to the public. So Alibaba, there was an Alibaba here in Ann Arbor that's now Baba Dari, right? Yeah, just changed. This was in Pittsburgh in the 70s. There's an Aladdin restaurant in at least 36 different states. That's the last time I counted. It might be more at this point. Very common way to sell food. Sinbad is also very popular. And even if they're not named Alibaba or Sinbad, like this is named Talal's after the owner here in Dearborn in the 90s, it still has the decor reminiscent of how Hollywood depicted the Arab world. Not really super accurate representation of, especially these are all Lebanese and Syrian owned, but that's how they sold their food. I don't know, has anyone ever been to this place? This was in Highland Park in the 50s and 60s. I wish this place was still around. I love the architecture. I love this table right here. I would love to sit there and have some food. But very common way to sell food to the public was through stereotypical means. But it wasn't, so Arab Americans had been in the food industry. One of the earliest things they did was owned restaurants and cafes and import stores, but they didn't only serve Arab food. This was one of the longest running and most popular restaurants in lower Manhattan called Khalil's, owned by a couple of Lebanese immigrants, and they served not a single Arab-influenced food. Veal fricassee, baked sausage, prime rib, lima beans. I mean, it's just a very general menu. And I love how when you look at these prices, you're like, wow, $20 for an entree, that's pretty good. I mean, that was 20 cents, right? So, but it's like it's what, 100% increase from 20 cents to $20 or 1,000? I don't know. I don't know my math, but it's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot. So used to be able to get an entree for 20 cents, now it's $20. But they decorated the restaurant. It's kind of hard to tell in here. On the back of this postcard, they had an oriental room with like palm trees and things like that, which was also very common at the time, to be reminiscent of Victorian Orientalism of the 1890s and later. So they were playing into that as well as kind of stereotyping themselves as being from the East and bringing that Eastern element to the food, even though they didn't serve anything related to Arab. So questions on this history or the history of Arab Americans. I didn't really get into like the general history of who they are and everything. We can talk about that more. The second half of the talk, I'm going to shift to focusing on Metro Detroit and that history, and then we'll kind of finish with what's going on now. What's the food landscape look like now in Metro Detroit? All right. So we're going to kind of delve into probably what we're more familiar with is Metro Detroit. So one of the first restaurants that I can find owned by a Syrian immigrant in Detroit was this picture from 1911, Joseph Naiman's Cafe, and I doubt they served Arab food. It was probably a lunch counter for workers. I think this was somewhere near the Del Rey, so it probably catered to a lot of workers. But it was very common for Syrian and Lebanese immigrants, much like Greek immigrants who opened lunch counters. One of the first things they did might not necessarily serve their ethnic food, but they opened lunch counters. It was very easy for them, and they shared resources. Yes?
Is this also a grocery store, or is the produce advertising?
I think it's like a restaurant and small grocery store, and then later it became a tobacco shop. So I think it's just kind of like mixing all those genres together. Yeah, could you see the bananas kind of hanging here, which are pretty wonderful. Yeah, I don't know much about this. I can't really find a lot of information about it other than the photo and the person and location. So the Arab American community in Detroit by this time, 1910, 1911, they owned about a dozen establishments, mostly fruit markets in Eastern and Western Market, a lot of produce stands, a couple Oriental rug shops, some dry goods import areas or places, but not many restaurants yet. So where are we today? So Metro Detroit, I'm thinking mainly Wayne County, Oakland County, Macomb County. There are at least 200 Arab food establishments, and I'm talking restaurants, cafes, bakeries, meat shops. I think that's a really low estimate. That's just what I could prove. I'm going to say it's well over 300 because in the city of Dearborn alone, there are 75 Arab-owned restaurants and bakeries. And there's actually probably more than that. That's just the ones I know of. So if you take into consideration the Iraqi community in Sterling Heights in Macomb County and the Syrian and Lebanese communities throughout Oakland County and other parts of Wayne County, it's probably 300 plus. And these are Arab restaurants that serve Arab food. So not just Arab restaurants owned by Arabs, which makes the number even higher. There's a lot of Coney Islands owned by Arab Americans and things like that. So these are Arab-owned restaurants that serve, maybe not predominantly, but at least serve some Arab food, probably well over 300. So what is the cuisine like in Metro Detroit? Well, until recently, almost all restaurants would serve basically the same stuff. They would serve Levantine-style cuisine, which is mainly Lebanese, Syrian, and some Palestinian, but mainly Lebanese because that was the largest community at the time, and they were the ones that first started owning restaurants. So they set the menus based on what they were serving. And then the next people to open restaurants were like, hey, what sells? Okay, it's all the stuff these Lebanese people are selling. So they kept selling the same stuff. So we get a very standardized menu by the 1960s and 70s where you could go to any Arab, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean restaurant in Metro Detroit and expect to have the same foods, regardless of the nationality of the owners and regardless of when they immigrated or if they weren't immigrants at all. So we get a very standardized menu, much like Chinese restaurants at the time, even today, have very standardized menus. It doesn't matter where the owners are from, what part of China, what kind of cuisine they grew up with. When you open a restaurant, you learn very quickly what will Americans eat in this area, and these are the foods they were eating. Now, we've got like shish kebab, shish tawuk, grape leaves, hummus, different kinds of kibbeh. The really adventurous restaurants will have kibbeh naye, will have the raw kibbeh, but not everybody serves that. They also, you almost can't go to a Lebanese or Iraqi-owned restaurant or Yemeni-owned restaurant and see some kind of pizza or burgers or subs, just other kinds of non-Arab food, because that's what people order, that's what people want. Now, Dearborn's a little different than other areas of the country that don't have that kind of concentration. So in Dearborn, you can serve kind of foods that might be considered more village foods or foods you might eat at home, because there are so many people from that ethnic group there to support it. But Lebanese restaurants I've been to Lebanese restaurants in like Washington, D.C. or in Raleigh, North Carolina. They have a much more limited menu and only serve the kind of things you would expect, the meats and the rices. Not a lot of stew kind of things that you might have at home. So the restaurant food versus kitchen food is kind of different. But a very standardized menu. Even later, Yemeni immigrants would come and open a restaurant. They would serve almost exclusively Lebanese food because that's what they assumed people were going to want to buy. And we can talk a little bit more about that standardization. So the next few slides are going to be food you get in Dearborn that aren't really standard menu foods, because we all kind of know the standard menu food. So I'm going to try to show some of the other things that are happening and talk about the people that eat them and why. So this is a beef shawarma, pretty common. This is at Habib's, which is a big restaurant and banquet hall in East Dearborn. But it also has their potato balls. Now, I haven't done any research on the genesis of the potato balls, but I assume they weren't Arab in origin. Many of the Arab folks who opened restaurants in Dearborn in the 70s and 80s were buying these restaurants off of Italian and Polish folks who were moving out further into the suburbs. So it's possible that some of the things that you find at Arab restaurants in Dearborn are holdovers from when they bought the restaurant. They didn't want to completely change everything because they didn't want to alienate all of their customers. And so the potato balls, which are kind of these wonderful, like buttery, they say they're roasted, but I swear they're fried. I don't know. They're seasoned, and so other Arab restaurants have copied this. And so many, when you do banquets from these restaurants, potato balls is an option. I haven't figured out where they have come from yet. Another example of this is there's one of the best places in Dearborn to get fresh bread and fresh menaish, fresh like cheese and spinach pies is at Roma Bakery. So Roma Bakery is owned by Lebanese folks, but as you can tell from the name, it used to be an Italian bakery, a very popular Italian bakery in Dearborn, and they were known for their pepperoni rolls. So when the Lebanese folks bought it, and they were Lebanese Muslims, they bought it and they still served pepperoni rolls. To this day, they still serve pepperoni rolls, but they're halal pepperoni, so they're beef and not pork. So they kept the tradition alive of what the Italian folks were buying in the neighborhood, even though that neighborhood now is like 95% Arab. Yeah.
Where's the Roma Bakery?
Roma Bakery is on Schaefer between Ford and Warren. It's really tiny. They're only open till like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. If you get there early, they're pulling the stuff right out of the oven, and it's really cheap and it's amazing. Some other things here. This is Kanefa Bekayak, which is kanefa. Who's had kanefa? It's like a sweet cheese dessert. This is served in a sesame bun. So you have a big hunk of the kanefa, and they put it in a bun, and they cover it with the syrup, and that's breakfast. So it's this is a breakfast place on Warren Avenue called Les Bons Sweets. And so it's certain parts of Lebanon, and this is a breakfast treat. I don't know how many calories it is. I've never been able to finish an entire one because these buns are like this big. And then the piece of kanefa that goes in it is just as big, and then they cover it in syrup, and it is good, but it's a lot. But it's not something you're going to get at a restaurant. You have to go to a specialized bakery. Only a few bakeries have this, but it's like village food. It's the food that people eat back home, and so you won't find it, and I've never seen it on the menu of any restaurant. And then the menaish, which is the standard pies, the za'atar pie, the meat pie, the cheese pie. Every bakery, there's like a dozen good bakeries in Dearborn. They all have these. They're like between 75 cents and $1.50 a piece. And they're like this big, and they're amazing. But it's not restaurant food. You're not going to find this typically on a restaurant menu. Maybe they'll give like smaller versions of it as an appetizer or something, but this is food that is ubiquitous in Dearborn. Everybody eats it, breakfast, lunch, sometimes dinner, late night snack, but it's not on any of the restaurant menus. It's a very specific kind of food. And then there's other kind of outliers. There's places that have a little bit more of a unique flavor than your typical Lebanese inspired menu. This is called El Shabab. It's on Warren Avenue in Dearborn. Anybody been to El Shabab? It's quite good. It is Syrian owned. Okay, not.
It's really nice.
It is Syrian owned. It's the husband and wife who run it are recent immigrants from Syria. They're from the Aleppo area, so it specializes in Aleppan cuisine, which you can see in some of the breakfast things they offer, which is on the back of the menu. It's very small. There's about 5 or 6 tables in there. I love how you're greeted. There's a picture on the door of like a lamb's head. So kind of lets you know what you're about to head into. But they're really well known for their cherry kebab, which is little like round meatball kind of things in like a sweet cherry sauce with dried cherries. Very unique kind of thing served over rice. You're not going to find that at any of the Lebanese restaurants in the area. They have the mahamra, that's like a red pepper paste that they put on bread and bake it on the pita bread with onion, and it's really just amazing. So you're going to find things here you're not going to find at other restaurants. But then they also have, subs like, who hasn't had the Romeo and Juliet chicken sub? I don't even know what that is. I would never go there and order a sub. I'm going to go there. I'm ordering the kebab and things. But they have the falafel. They have the sujuk, which is the Armenian sausage that most places in Dearborn have. They have the kifta and the tawuk, but they've got these specialties that you kind of have to know. This is the kind of place where when I go in, I sometimes don't even open the menu. We just ask like, hey, bring out the stuff you're in the mood to make right now. And they'll do that. They're really nice. It's a great, don't tell too many people about this place though. Trying to keep it quiet, but you're all welcome to go there. And I hope that you will. It's a really great place. Right now, the hottest thing in Dearborn and beyond is Yemeni food. How many people are familiar with Yemeni cuisine? It's fantastic. The Yemenis have been in Metro Detroit since the 1920s. When the Yemenis first started to immigrate, it was mostly single men who came to make money to send back home. They worked in the automobile factories, but many of them worked on the Great Lakes on ships. They were recruited by Henry Ford specifically because Yemenis were known for being able to build ships and work on ships because Yemen's a couple big ports of commerce. So you go back if you go to the Dawson Great Lakes Museum and you see some of the names in the 20s and 30s of people who have perished on ships, you'll see some Yemeni names on there every once in a while. So the Yemenis have been in the area for a long time, and they've owned cafes for a long time. And since the 60s and 70s in Dearborn, but they weren't cafes that any of us would have gone to. They were mainly these little coffee houses that only the Yemeni community went to. And then eventually they started opening more restaurants, but they were opening restaurants that served almost exclusively Lebanese food because they knew that's what would sell. They didn't think people were ready for Yemeni food until you have Hamtramck. You have Hamtramck, which in the last 15 plus years has become a Yemeni stronghold among other ethnic groups. And so then that's where your first Yemeni restaurants serving almost exclusively Yemeni menus to a non-Yemeni public really start to pop up. And then in the last few years in Dearborn, you've got some Yemeni restaurants like Sheba, which started in Hamtramck, but there's now one, actually started in Dearborn, then Hamtramck, now back to Dearborn. You've got a good 3 or 4 Yemeni restaurants and bakeries that have opened on Michigan Avenue in East Dearborn. And it's very different kinds of food than you're going to find at a Lebanese restaurant. Lots of the same kind of base ingredients: rice, lamb, chicken, prepared slightly different, actually prepared more along the lines of things you might find at certain Indian restaurants. In fact, Yemeni bread, they call it tandoor bread, and it's made almost like naan, very similar. Yemen was at the crossroads of commerce for thousands of years, so their cuisine has been influenced in that way. But a lot of it is served on platters where you're supposed to share. Now, of course, these restaurants will serve, you can go get a falafel sandwich, right? But if you're going to go to a Yemeni restaurant, you need to get the lamb platters because they're massive and they're fun and they're delicious. But that's a recent development that Yemenis have been serving Yemeni food. In fact, the biggest restaurant in Dearborn right now, the Sheba restaurant, even says on their sign, Sheba Yemeni/Mediterranean food, because they still have the kebab and the falafel. So I'm not like the expert on the food. I'll eat it, but so here we've got. So it's on a bed of rice where some of the rice has been dyed with different saffron or turmeric or whatever, yellow and orange, and then you've got there's like a galaba here. It's kind of like a meat stir fry kind of thing, a stew. And then here's lamb hanith. So it's lamb it's the most tender lamb you can get anywhere in the area. Hands down. If I have people all the time, I hate lamb, I don't eat lamb. Taken to Sheba, mind changed. This isn't like lamb and mint jelly out of the oven. This has been probably slaughtered locally within the last day or two, or not too soon, but it's been slaughtered recently, and it's cooked in a hot oven, almost like I think, is it in the tandoor they do the hanith? I think so, kind of. But it's just amazing. It falls right off the bone. And there's some chicken here, also very similarly spiced, and some potatoes. Some of their other well-known dishes that you can get there is salta or fasa, which the fasa is like a shredded lamb with almost like a mashed potato consistency served in a hot cast iron bowl, and it comes bubbling to the table. Almost like bibimbap, when it's served in the hot bowl, you can still cook the egg. Very similar. And then, the edges of it get all crusty inside. It's really beautiful, and you eat it with bread. And the salta is a vegetarian, okra and potato and carrot in like a stew served in that hot bowl as well. Salta? Oh, the fasa is, they spell it Fahssa or Fahsa. Salta is Salta. It's very good. It's one of and they also have a lamb soup, which is basically just lamb broth made from the bones. And so it's just lamb and black pepper, and it's really amazing on a cold day. It's just a broth. Oh, it's so good. But yeah, I feel bad because I was raised on Lebanese style cuisine, and I will bypass that any day to go to a Yemeni restaurant nowadays. So but it's really good. It is. Other folks. So it's not just Lebanese and Palestinian and Yemeni. There's a lot of Iraqi cuisine in the area, and there are a couple distinct ways you can experience Iraqi cuisine. So in Dearborn, if you go to an Iraqi place, it's likely owned by an Iraqi Muslim. And it's likely owned by somebody who was more recently immigrated than, say, up in Sterling Heights, where it's mostly owned by Chaldeans, some of which who are recent immigrants or refugees, but some have also been here since the 70s and the 80s. And so in Dearborn, most of the Iraqi places are what you would call like kebab joints. Really small, much smaller than this room, maybe 5 tables, and they serve mainly just meat grilled over an open flame. And some of the small places you walk in, you can see the flames behind the counter. Our Bio Kebab actually burned down at one point. It has been rebuilt, luckily, because it's my favorite place. This is on Greenfield, just south of Warren. And the difference between Iraqi kefta, so kefta is the ground meat kebab instead of the chunk of meat, it's much fattier than you get in the Lebanese restaurants. And so it's very gristly, and it's just amazing. And it's and when you go, you ask for the saboon, which is the Iraqi bread, which is, it's not like pita at all. It's really thick. It's like thick and pillowy, and it's just gorgeous. You shove the kefta in there, and it's really good. So these places,
because it's airy inside?
it's pretty dense still.
Oh, dense.
Yeah, it's not like really airy. It's not like when you go to a Lebanese restaurant and they give you the little puffed up bread out of the oven, and then you poke it and it just flattens. No, this is like, it's really thick and dense. It's amazing. There's an episode actually of, it came out last year. It's called No Passport Required. It's Marcus Samuelsson. He's a chef. He's on like Chopped and all these. He's pretty one of these celebrity chefs. It's on PBS. You can find it on Amazon Prime or whatever. And it's an hour-long show all about the food in Metro Detroit, Arab food in Metro Detroit. And they go into one of these Iraqi places where they're making the bread, and it's beautiful. So it's called No Passport Required. They go to all. They really did a number going to all these different Arab food places in Detroit. So check it out. It's really good. It just came out last year. So if you go up to Sterling Heights, though, which is like Chaldean town, these are all the Iraqi Catholics. They're gonna have little kebab joints, but they're also gonna have the more kind of fancy banquet hall kind of places like Sahara or Ishtar, or what are the other ones up there? Any Sterling Heights folks? But mostly these like kind of large palace-like interior places, and their menus are going to look more like a Lebanese restaurant, except they'll have a handful of Iraqi specialties, but mainly they're just serving the same stuff you're going to find elsewhere. I mean, it's still all very good. Like I'm like poo-pooing these Lebanese restaurants, like, oh, it's the same stuff. It's all very good. It's just it's nice to see places that are able to branch out and offer different things. Because here in this area, it really is like Lebanese, Syrian, some Palestinian food that's dominant. I mean, there's the Moroccan place over in Ypsilanti, right? That's pretty rare for this area. There's El Harissa Cafe off of Maple. That guy's from Algeria, so he offers a little bit of different flavor in some of his baked goods, but mainly it's, very Lebanese and Syrian. It's called El Harissa Market. It's in a little strip mall. It's kind of like a deli style.
Where and where?
Maple right before 14, right? Just south of M14. So pretty far north. Yeah, it's really small, but it's kind of like deli style. So you go in and you get food from the deli. It's not like a full service restaurant in that sense. And then I'm going to end on looking to the future. How are things kind of looking now? So you've got, because most of these communities have been here for many generations. And so you've got the young folks coming up who grew up eating hamburgers and pizza, along with the Lebanese food or Yemeni food at home. So most young restaurant owners, Arab American, are opening like burger joints and pizza places and sub shops, and some coffee houses. So this is Kahwa House, which is really beautiful. It's the shop off of Schaefer in East Dearborn, and it's owned by a Yemeni immigrant fella who gets his beans from his family farm in Yemen. So he's roasting Yemeni coffee in very traditional ways, and there's Yemeni sweets there. It's a really great place, but it kind of sees itself as like a hip coffee shop, and most of the people in there are from the community. But the way if you go to their Instagram page, I mean, the way they kind of want to sell themselves is like a hip, slow food, foodie kind of place. In fact, if you're around Wednesday the 20th at 6 o'clock on campus, I can give you the information later. He's going to be talking about what it's like dealing with the war in Yemen and his family, and still trying to operate his business and with Yemeni beans from his family farm. So that's going to be a really interesting talk, open to the public on campus on Wednesday.
But he lives here.
He lives in Dearborn. Yeah, he lives in Dearborn, and he's going to be opening a new bakery. And so there's really, really great entrepreneurial stuff happening with the community. And then the recognition that the community is now getting. So El Amir, which, how many of you have been to El Amir? It's one of the mainstays of East Dearborn. It's been there since like mid-1980s, one of the longest standing Arab restaurants in Dearborn. In 2016, they were honored with the James Beard American Classics Award. And so you start to see more awards coming to the community. Anthony Bourdain, when he was still with us, has been to these restaurants many times on different shows. Andrew Zimmern, who does the Bazaar Foods, has come through Dearborn a couple times. There's award-winning pastry chef Zelina Sarini. She's at Selden Standard. So she's a Lebanese Muslim woman who does the pastries at Selden Standard, which is this high-end restaurant in Detroit. So the Lebanese and Arab food is kind of like You're still going to find the community-based restaurants, but it is because the community is so large and it's been here for so long, it's making the kind of maneuvers that you would expect a community like that to do and branching out into different ways. All which is very exciting for someone like me, who's one of my jobs at the museum is to keep up with all of the food stuff that's happening in the community, and I do it very begrudgingly. But so that's it. Yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm open for a conversation and fellowship afterwards. So thank you.
This program was recorded on February 17th, 2019, at the Ann Arbor District Library.